welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Thanks a lot for joining us here today. We got a great show for you here today because, well, number one, our guest is live in studio with me here in Lethbridge, Alberta, so I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. If you have a question today for Ross McKenzie, all you have to do is enter it in the comment box, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, or Twitch. We'd love to have as many questions as possible. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. Or you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or the RealAg listener line, 855-776-6147 if you're a little bit more shy. So as I said, today's guest is Dr. Ross McKenzie, retired researcher with Alberta Ag. Hey, Ross, how's it going?
Not bad for an old guy.
How is retirement treating you?
Generally pretty good as long as I stay out of trouble, but I don't always do that, as you can see by my arm here. But anyway.
Yeah, you can't even blame it on a ski accident.
Well, I can't. I have to blame it on a hiking accident instead.
Anyway. Man, that sucks. But I'm glad you're here. It's great to have you. As I said on yesterday's show, Ross, you were like when I first started Real Agriculture, you were very much a go-to. We talked a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of videos of you and I discussing fertilizer and soil testing.
Yeah, and I had white hair then too. So.
I have a lot more now than I did then, for sure. So, hey, Ross, let's kind of get into it here and talk about this overall topic of fertilizer and soil testing. There's some good decisions and also some mistakes that can be made. It's kind of a critical time here in the fall.
Yep, it's a very important time, but one of the things I will point out, and I'm more than happy to share my experiences, but I always like to qualify or quantify what I say. And most of my research was done across Alberta, particularly in southern Alberta on irrigation and dryland. So a lot of the comments that I might make may well apply to most farmers in Alberta, to a lot of farmers in Saskatchewan, maybe not so much in Manitoba, and maybe not so much in Ontario. But always look at what I say or anybody says with a critical eye, and use critical thinking to decide what applies to me in my situation and what doesn't. So when you're listening to me today, take it all in, but decide what might apply to you and what might not.
Yeah, Pete and I talk about that all the time too, right? It's you got to, as long as you get a piece of it, and if that part is applicable to you and apply that to your farm, you're winning.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's talk about soil sampling. Before we can make any decision on fertilizer, we need to have the information, what's in the ground.
Yep. And in my mind, soil testing is very important, and we've been promoting that for over 40 years. So it's a great place to start, but it has to be done right.
Yeah. So what does doing it right look like?
Well, there's a lot of things. First of all, when you look at a field, how do you want to sample it? Do you just want to sample the whole field, like say a quarter section, or do you want to break it down into different management zones if you have variable soils? And for probably about half the farmers across the prairies, there's probably enough variability in your land. You might want to be looking at doing variable rate fertilizer. We can talk about that in more detail later. But that's the first thing you want to look at, is how should that field be sampled? And if, say for example, if the field is quite uniform, well, how many samples do you take? And some people say 5, 10. Usually I say an absolute minimum of 20, but really 25 to 30. And if you kind of stop and think, if you take a 0 to 6 inch depth sample in about 30 locations, you might wind up with about 2 pounds of soil. But that 2 pounds of soil has to represent that whole field. And a quarter section, 6 inches deep, that weighs 320 million pounds.
Oh.
So your 1 or 2 pounds has to represent that. So you can't take shortcuts and only take 5 or 6 or 7 cores. You have to take at least, in my opinion, 20 to 25, often even 30 if there's a little bit of variability. So that's, first of all, you have to take the correct number of samples. Then the second thing is, what depths do you want to be sampling? And I'm kind of a purist. I like to do it the best as possible. And I like to do a 0 to 6 inch depth, a 6 to 12 inch depth, and a 12 to 24 inch depth. So you take a 24 inch depth core and split it into 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24. And it gives you a nice breakdown. Unfortunately, a lot of fertilizer dealers, when they're sampling, don't want to take the time to break that into 3 depths. They'll do 2 depths, but not 3. So if it's going to be only 2 depths, I still want to go down to 24 inches, because often there'll be lots of sulfur or nitrogen down there. But and you want to see how much is there. But then what I would suggest to do is 0 to 6 inch depth sample, and then a 6 to 24. And I don't like that, but that would be the lesser of two evils.
Now, doing that, all 3 of those depths every year?
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes. So every time you go to soil sample, you want to do the 0 to 6 inch depth and keep that separate, because all of our soil test calibration across the prairies with phosphorus and potassium have been based on a 0 to 6 inch depth. And then for nitrogen and sulfur, our recommendations are developed on a 0 to 24-inch depth sample, but you want to see where that nitrogen is or where that sulfur is.
What about the timing? Fall best?
To be honest, if we talk about the time, really the very best time is as close to when you're going to see it as possible, because that's going to give you the best numbers as possible as to what's there. But is it practical? And that's, so if you sample a week before you're going to start fertilizing, or before seeding and fertilizing, well, that doesn't give you any time at all to get your sample in, get it analyzed back, decide what you're going to do, and then buy your fertilizer. So the ideal time is as close to seeding as possible, but realistically, if you can do it in late fall, that's really the best time from an overall time management standpoint. But you don't want to do it too soon. Like, for example, here we are on the 30th of September. If you sample today and your soils are moist and things continue to be warm, like yesterday was 25 degrees in Lethbridge.
It's gorgeous.
If it continues to stay like that and your soils are moist, there's going to be a fair amount of turnover of the organic matter releasing nutrients. So what you have September 30th might be very different as to what you have October 30th. And so that's why you want to wait to as close to freeze up to take your samples as possible. Then there's going to be hopefully minimal change from late October until spring.
Now, I know you're a big fan of riding along with the sampler. Now, are we not trusting of the sampler? Are we trying to learn? What are we doing
to be honest,
here?
It's a bit of both. To be honest, being an old government guy, I'm always a little bit skeptical. But so you have to keep that in mind. But the first thing is, for farmers, this is a beautiful learning opportunity. You can be out with a soil sampler, and then every time he pulls up a core, you can see, well, how deep is that topsoil? Is it 4 inches, 6 inches, 8 inches? At what depth do you hit that subsoil? And so you get to learn very quickly what is the variability you have in your field, especially if you have more variability in topography. It really gives you an idea of, you might only have 6 or 4 inches of topsoil on the hilltops, but you might have 8 or 10 inches in the lower relief area. So it gives you a really good opportunity to see the variability. And if the soil sampler has a bit of knowledge on soils, he can be explaining some of that to you as well. Plus, I just finished saying, you want to have about 25 samples taken in each field, and so you can make sure that gets done too. Yeah, so it's wise, in my opinion. I always encourage farmers to go with a sampler if they can.
Hey, farmers are good at micromanagement. Mm-hmm. It's I could see you learning a lot, like in terms of seeing it done would allow you to maybe sort of connect some dots on some of the information you got, right? Especially as it applies to when we look at the testing, the consistency, or making sure we're taking the test where kind of the instructions were and things like that. Knowing the soil type, super critical though in this whole process.
Absolutely. So those are some of the basic things you want to do. Make sure you do 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 24 inch depths, 25 samples in each field. Okay.
What should we be testing for? What obviously NP and K, but what about other stuff?
Mm-hmm. Well, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur are the big ones you want to sample for. A lot of labs will say they'll do calcium, magnesium, but for the vast majority of farmers across the prairies, we've got lots, so you probably don't need it. It might be something you might want to do every now and then, but in most cases you don't need to worry about it. You've got lots. And then we look at micronutrients. The vast areas of our prairies don't need micronutrients, but still, it's wise to check it. We have some zinc deficiency problems on some of our irrigated sandy soils in southern Alberta, copper deficiencies on some of our black, gray-black transition soils in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and into Manitoba. So testing for micronutrients is maybe a wise idea once every 3 to 5 years. But when you test and if your fields are fine, then I don't think I'd worry about it. Again, there's no point in doing micronutrients every year because they're not going to change much from year to year.
Macros every year, micros every 3 to 5.
Yes.
Okay, that's good rules to live by. I think people can definitely that they can make sense of that.
And there's some other things you can test for as well. Like I always like to look at soil pH, especially if you're doing variable rate fertilizer applications. You can get quite dramatic differences in organic matter and pH. So it's nice to know what they are from one zone to the next. And
organic matter?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for example, one of our variable rate research sites we'd had just south of Lethbridge, the first year we started it, we found soil pH varied from 5.3 to 7.8. And that was actually a bit of even a surprise for me, is that you'd have that much variability in the dark brown soil zone across a quarter section. So it's nice to see what that variability is going to be and how that might influence your fertilizer management as well.
So you get the results back, and sometimes when you look at those sheets, I find it's like, what am I actually looking at? Mm-hmm. What is it telling me? I've heard some of on the corn side, some of the high agronomy farmers talk about, what is that benchmark? You got to be careful what some of those graphs look like.
Yep.
Let's talk about interpreting the
Yeah.
results so you're making a good decision.
Maybe even before we do that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
When we are talking about soil testing, it's important to use the right test as well.
Okay.
Well, I'll just use the example for phosphorus. We did a lot of work back in the 90s looking at a number of different methods to decide which phosphorus soil test method was giving us the best results. It turned out to be the modified Kelowna method that was developed in BC. And it worked by far the best. It gave us the best correlations over a wide pH range for phosphorus. But so that's one of the things Alberta farmers and Saskatchewan farmers might want to request is you want the modified Kelowna method done on your phosphorus to determine phosphorus. But for farmers in Manitoba, the recommended method is the method called the Olsen method. It's they use sodium bicarbonate to extract phosphorus. Okay. But that's because their soils tend to be more high pH calcareous type soils in Manitoba, so that particular test works better. And that's actually adjusted to a pH of 8.5, that extraction solution. But if you use that method in Alberta on our more acidic soils, like you have a pH of 6.5, 6 or 5.5, it's not going to work very well.
That's a good question to ask then.
So making sure you use the right test, and then some farmers will have or agronomists will send their samples to the States or Eastern Canada, and a common method is for phosphorus that is used is the Bray method, but it's it's a strong acid extractant, and if you use it on a higher pH soil that is above a pH of 7, it's not going to work. It just gets the extraction solution just gets neutralized, so you can't pull out much phosphorus. So it becomes very important to make sure you're using the right test. And that's one thing I like about the modified Kelowna. It's a weak acid extractant. It's highly buffered, so it's not really affected much by organic matter or soil pH. So using the right method is very important. So when you're having your field sampled, make sure you talk to your agronomist to find out where your samples are being sent, what are the methods being used, so they can be interpreted correctly. And if, like for some agronomists, they'll send their samples away to a lab, and they'll get the Bray and the Olsen method back, don't even use the modified Kelowna, and then how can you make a top-notch recommendation for phosphorus when you're not using the right methods?
Now, all three of those methods they've been around for a long time, right?
Yep. Well, the modified Kelowna was actually developed in the 1980s at the BC Ministry of Agriculture Lab, so not too long. The Olsen method was developed in 1954 by Olsen and co-workers at Colorado State University, and the Bray method was actually developed by Bray and Kurtz in 1945. So now that's even before my time. So, those are older methods. But in some regions they actually work quite well on the acid soils in the States. They actually work that method. Works quite well. But for Alberta, Saskatchewan, I'd recommend the modified Kelowna method.
It's just weird we haven't seen more new methods like over time with all the technology that we have now. It's just
And with the cutbacks in agriculture, we're not going to see it. But the soil testing is so important when you kind of think that, farmers across Western Canada probably spend about $2.5 billion on fertilizer. But how much fertilizer research or how much soil test research are we doing? It's absolutely minimal.
Yeah, for sure. I got a question here. Lindsay says the 80s feel like a really long time ago. Dr. McKenzie, yes, they absolutely do. Let's talk about interpretation. Interpreting the results. Yes. What do we need to do? What are we looking at here?
Well, we've done in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. You go back, and we can go back to the 80s, and even before that, there has been a lot of soil test calibration work done, looking at the methods and fertilizer response. And that's really what I would encourage people to do: is go back and look at the recommendations that have been developed. So, for example, in Alberta, you can go to the Alberta Agriculture website, look at the phosphorus fertilizer fact sheet, potassium fertilizer fact sheet, sulfur fertilizer fact sheet,
right,
and look at the recommendations we've actually developed over the years for the various crops based on different soil test different soils tests we have, and go from there. So that would be the one thing that I would do. For another thing that the farmers in Alberta can actually do is go to the Alberta Agriculture website and download a program called AFIRM. It stands for Alberta Farm Fertilizer Information Recommendation Manager. And Len Krasnowski, when he was still with Alberta Agriculture, took all of our research data, put it all into one big program. So you can actually input where your farm is, so you know the soil test zone or the soil zone you're in, the crop you want to grow, and then it'll actually bring up the calibration curves we have for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, and help you develop your fertilizer recommendations. So a tool like that is actually invaluable, and I'd encourage farmers in Alberta to go to something like that and to develop their fertilizer recommendations.
One of the things you said to me is that the lab doesn't know your soil. What do you and so what do you mean by that? Because they're actually doing the test, so
Yes.
don't they know what the soil is?
Well, they know what the soil texture is, but they don't know the soil zone you're in, your agroecological, what are the climatic things you're dealing with. So I always say soil test labs are in the business of soil testing, but it's really up to the farmer to develop his own fertilizer recommendations, or at least to do that in consultation with his fertilizer dealer or a private agronomist working with him. And that way you can fine-tune your fertilizer recommendations to your fields. You know which fields produce a little better or maybe a little worse. And you know if you have good soil moisture going to the spring or poor soil moisture, how your fields respond. So you always want to kind of fine-tune things to your specific conditions.
I like the researcher coming out of you there, the skepticism. I I like it. Okay, so I mentioned the graphs. Some of the reports are all different. But you need to understand when they do give you a recommendation. What are they actually saying and the why? I think the why of that is really important, isn't it?
And that's sometimes where you have to kind of do some of that yourself.
Okay.
I know that I saw on Twitter last fall there was an irrigation farmer in southern Alberta had a soil test done, and he was kind of very pleased with it. But I looked at it and I thought, I wouldn't be if I saw that recommendation. They used the right soil tests, and it was for a 100 bushel wheat crop. But his soil test for phosphorus was low, and they only recommended 25 pounds of phosphorus. That was half of what should have been recommended. So the farmer really wants to do his own due diligence to figure out, what's a reasonable recommendation. That's why I encourage, look at the AgDex publications we've written with our fertilizer recommendation charts for the different soil zones and the different crops, and then go to something like a firm. And one of the things I like about a firm is you can even put in the cost of your nitrogen fertilizer. It'll give you the fertilizer response curve, and then as you increase the value or decrease the value of your wheat and the nitrogen fertilizer, you can kind of decide where you want to be on that curve.
So go ahead.
And so by doing that, you can make a much more informed economic decision. If you're just kind of picking numbers off a chart, well, you're low in phosphorus, so put on this. You're high in potassium, you don't need that.
Right.
That's a good starting point, but you want to do some more fine-tuning to that if you can.
It goes another way too. I was kind of laughing because I can remember several times growing up on the farm where it was the recommendation would be X. I don't know about that. We'll just go what we usually do: 100 pounds of N and 15 of phos. So then that kind of defeats the purpose of actually doing the test. The test was sort of a check mark. We're supposed to do it, but you didn't really use the results either. It's kind of, that's a waste of time and money as well.
Absolutely, because you really want to look at each of your nutrients. Where are they at? And often some of the labs will give you a bit of a bar graph showing if you're low, medium, or high for different nutrients. So it's visually nice, but different labs do have different philosophies in their interpretation too. So that's why I always throw it back to the farmer. And you have to make that final decision. But do it in consultation with a fertilizer dealer or a private agronomist. And if you're still not sure, like if you're getting a recommendation for potassium and you're not sure, well, what would the Alberta Agriculture fact sheet say about it? So that there's another option for looking at, for clarifying if you need it or not. But don't be afraid to phone up and get another opinion or two from other people who are maybe unbiased and give an honest opinion. I still get farmers even phoning me now. What do you think of this or think of that? And they know they're going to get my honest opinion. Right.
Well, exactly. Okay, so harvest in parts of Western Canada, it's been on a very nice schedule. We're hitting some nice timelines. There's opportunities here to do some of those fall activities, weed control, fall fertilization. Is fall fertilization for everybody?
It's not for everybody, but there's a lot of people that could take advantage of it. Again, I hate to always be referring back to fact sheets, but Doom Polly and I wrote a fact sheet, kind of the pros and cons and the risks of fall fertilizing on the Alberta Agriculture website. So that'd be a good place to start, just to understand some of the more of the details. But for example, if you were to go on tomorrow, October 1st, and put on nitrogen fertilizer in southern Alberta and you have good moist soil on irrigated land, probably in 2 to 3 weeks, most of that nitrogen fertilizer will convert over to nitrogen, or nitrate nitrogen. And nitrate is fairly mobile. It will move downwards if we get more precipitation later fall or in the spring if we have a wet spring. Some of that nitrogen could start leaching down. But even more important, on our heavier soils, if they become saturated with water, then the microbes in the soil can start stripping the oxygen off that nitrate nitrogen and reduce it down to nitrite and finally nitrous oxide, and then it'll be lost back to the air as a gas. So one of the risks of fertilizing with nitrogen in the fall, if you do it too early, it converts over to nitrate, nitrogen, then it could be lost later in fall or in the spring. So, so for farmers in southern Alberta or southern Saskatchewan and the brown and dark brown soils, we don't often have wet springs. So then the risk of losing your nitrogen, if you do put it on in the fall, is going to be less. But if you move into the kind of the black and the gray-black transition soils of the central north central prairies, they tend to be wetter in the spring. If you put fertilizer on in the fall, there's a higher risk for losing it in the spring.
It's like the Red Deers, North Battlefords, no swift currents, Lethbridges. Yes. If you're inside the Palliser Triangle and dry land, it's probably a good thing to do.
You're probably home free. Yes. Most years.
Well, there's got to be some advantage of it being so bloody dry all the time.
That's right. So that's one of the advantages. So you want to look at those sorts of things. So when it comes to fertilizing in the fall, I would recommend it. But the other thing is, I'd also recommend try to do it in the latest fall as possible. Try and do it in the 3rd or 4th week of October, and then you put your nitrogen down as urea. It maybe will convert over to ammonium, but ammonium is actually very stable. It's not going to leach. Okay. There's almost no chance of volatilization. So even for farmers in north central Alberta, you could actually put it down. But if you want to put it down as anhydrous ammonia or urea in the very late fall, as long as it stays in that ammonium form, odds are you're going to be okay the following spring.
Can you apply too late?
No, you can't really apply it too late, although you have to keep in mind in some place like in Manitoba, they do have restrictions on when you can fertilize in late at the end of fall, or when you can start fertilizing in the spring. But we don't have those regulations in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So
we're a little more cowboy out here.
Yeah, quite a bit more actually.
Okay.
Truth for no one.
Yeah. A product like ESN, like a slow release, does that fit in the fall, or is that more of a spring product?
You can use it fall or spring. It works very well. And you certainly can use it in the fall. And if you are in an area that's more prone to loss, we did a lot of work with ESN across Alberta, right from south of Lethbridge foremost all the way up to the Peace River region, with wheat, barley, and canola using ESN and conventional products, fall applied, spring applied. And for the most part, ESN does work quite well.
Question here from Jim Hale, who is in Lancer, Saskatchewan. So he counts. He's in the Palliser Triangle. Yep. Jim wants to know, broadcast the N on snow.
Normally, I'm not a big fan, but if it's in the spring, if you get the frost is already out of the ground, and you get a bit of wet snow, like say 3 or 4 inches, and there's no frost in the ground, you can do it. But if you have more than about 4 inches of snow on the soil surface, that pellet may not burn its way all the way down to the soil surface, and so that would be a concern. But there is a time and a place for it. But I wouldn't do it in the middle of the winter when the ground is frozen and you got a foot of snow. And if you do get a rapid snow melt in the spring, you can start getting shifting, especially if you have rolling topography, get some shifting of that nitrogen, so it won't be uniformly spread by the time the snow is finished melting.
Ken says, I've always applied ammonia, and people say that it hurts soil biology. Is that the case? And does it really matter what form of N to apply, mostly down the mid-row banders at seeding?
Right. If you put on anhydrous ammonia, we all know it is toxic. But so when you put it down in a band, right at the point of injection, the anhydrous ammonia will almost kind of freeze dry the microbes at that point of injection. But you go back 5 days later, once the nitrogen is there, and then the microbes will start to flourish, and actually there'll be more microbes 5 days later than there was before. So there's a short temporary negative effect, but the microbes quickly respond, start reproducing in a warm, moist soil. So I don't worry about putting on anhydrous ammonia at all.
Okay, good stuff. Hey, thanks for the questions, everybody. If you do have a question for Ross, continue on. Ask them in the comment box, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, or Twitch. So let's talk about variable rate. I wouldn't say that. I would say you're critical. There's things that you can do right in variable rate, and there's things you can do wrong. Let's talk about what you need to do to make sure it's successful.
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, I am a big fan of variable rate fertilizer application.
Okay.
Even back in the 80s, when we didn't have sophisticated equipment, I would encourage farmers to put phosphate on their hilltops or manure on their hilltops to build them up. And so we've just kind of been progressing from there. We did a fair amount of variable rate fertilizer research on variable landscapes. That was one of the last projects I worked on before I retired, and there's definitely a time and a place for it. But the first thing you have to kind of decide, is your soil variable enough, your topography and soil variable enough you really would benefit from it. And there's probably at least 6 different major companies out there that are doing that work. But you want to talk to their agronomists. Just don't talk to one, talk to a few of them to find out what services that they offer, what are the costs, and maybe try it on a small scale on maybe a couple of quarters to see how it works for you. But I always say you want to find out how much is that agronomist that's calls himself a precision agronomist know. And for the first thing I'm going to ask you, did you take a course in soil fertility and fertilizers at university? If they haven't, well, then I'm looking for somebody else. But the second thing they should have taken is a course in soil classification and soil mapping. And again, how can you be a precision agronomist mapping soils on a farmer's field if you've never taken soil classification and mapping? That's critical. But you have to know more than that. You're going to have different soil types in different areas in a field. So you want that agronomist to have maybe a class in soil mineralogy, soil physics, soil chemistry, soil microbiology, so they really understand the workings of the soil and understand the different physical and chemical properties of the different soils you have in your different soil management zones. And so that really becomes very critical. So you really want to almost kind of interview the different precision agronomists to see how knowledgeable they are, what's their area of expertise, how much do they really know.
And what their theory is.
Exactly.
Like how do they approach this, right?
Yes.
Because
and then every company has different ways of developing their soil management zones. And if you're just doing it with just yield maps or just satellite imagery, well, that's really not good enough. You really want to use a number of different techniques to build your soil zones, but you want to have somebody who's very knowledgeable in soils kind of doing the work for you.
Olds College, they have a precision.
They have started this a program. That's right. Yes.
That's good.
Yeah, that's very good. I'm delighted to see that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's one of those jobs I think that we are going to see a lot more of need for in the future.
That's right.
Especially as this kind of grows. And so when you say you need to have variability in the soil, can you kind of define that for us a little bit?
Well, for example, if you have a rolling landscape, so you're going to have kind of hilltops, mid-slope, lower slope, and depressional areas. So you got sort of maybe 4 very significant different soil areas in a field with rolling topography. We have to remember those soils have been forming for the last 10,000 years since the last glaciation retreated. The hilltops tended to be drier, so they're going to typically have less soil profile development, less soil organic matter in the surface of soil. So your A horizon is going to be thinner, lower organic matter, probably lower fertility. The subsoil is going to be closer to the soil surface. Odds are soil pH is going to be higher. But then as you go down slope to the mid-slope and the lower slope position, odds are the lower slope is going to, over years of snowfall and rainfall, water is going to have been moving down to the lower slope positions. So you're going to have more soil development in the lower slope position. So you're going to have a deeper A horizon, often a higher soil organic matter, often a lower soil pH, higher for fertility. You may, in some cases, you might even have a bit of a higher water table in some cases. And in the depressional areas, odds are you probably might even have what we call glycolic soils, high water table. Depending on the groundwater situation, you might have salinity. And so then you want to be looking to is that going to be an issue? But so really you want to be looking at all those sort of different physical and chemical properties in the upper, mid, and lower slope positions to help you decide how each area should be managed differently from a soil fertility standpoint.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. It's hard not to get a little bit lost in it, because it's something that seems at 100,000 feet super simple, but when you get into the real science of it, right on the ground, you can make some decisions that can really kind of hurt you, or you'll be regrettable, or really lead you, to have a bit of a launch point in higher yielding situations. So it's a time for critical thinking.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and so from a technology standpoint, what are some of the things that you're looking ahead for? Like obviously we talked about some of the slow release stuff. That was kind of a big technology that's kind of been developed. Is there more stuff coming down the line, do you think, that's going to really help improve some of this stuff?
There's all kinds of different sort of new technologies coming along in terms of new fertilizer products. For example, embedding very, very small micron-sized sulfur into other fertilizer products to give you that source of elemental sulfur, which will then release. We did some work, even though I was retired, the fellow who replaced me doing poly was doing some work with a company that had developed a very fine sulfur product. It was very small micron size that could be sprayed on, and was actually releasing surprisingly quickly. We used to think elemental would take 2 or 3 years to release. Well, that was actually releasing in the year of application very nicely. So there's all kind of new things coming out, and even when I retired, we really just had Agrotane was about the only product really had as a urease inhibitor to slow down nitrogen release, but now there's more new products out, and so I think we'll see more of those kind of things coming along the way as well. But the one thing that I'm very disappointed though about is when you look at Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, we just don't have the people doing soil fertility and fertilizer research that we used to have. And farmers, like I say, being across the prairie probably spend $2.5 billion in fertilizer, but we just don't have all that fertilizer research going on to develop and keep up to date fertilizer response curves for nitrogen and fine tuning phosphorus. For example, you look at the fact sheet that I wrote on phosphorus that's on the Alberta Ag website. I wrote that in 2013, but it's 7 years old. And if they would let me go back and rewrite it, I would change things. We have fertilizer recommendation rates at different soil test levels for each crop, but I'd like to see that more fine-tuned, so it's not just for different soil zone for that particular crop, but also for your target yield, because different yields, different yielding, the same crop yielding at different rates is going to pull out different rates of phosphate, and I think there's really a lot more room for really expanding our knowledge and developing better recommendations, but that kind of work is just not being done anymore, and to the detriment of farmers down the road.
To your knowledge, is the U.S. farmer facing the same sort of challenges like in the Montanas and Dakotas?
Well, when you look at the research that's going on in Alberta or Saskatchewan, Doom Pauly is the only person left who's solely dedicated to doing fertilizer research, and odds are he's going to get let go in the next couple of weeks by Alberta Agriculture. So we'll have nobody in Alberta. But you go down to Montana, I really like what Montana does. They have Montana State University with an excellent research group, but then they have 6 different satellite research centers with professors and scientists working, doing research there across the different agricultural zones in Montana. We don't have that in Alberta. At least we had Alberta Agriculture doing work in various areas of Alberta, but that's soon going to go by the wayside, and it'll be kind of left for applied research associations to do it, but they don't work together. They don't ever put information onto the Alberta Agriculture website for farmers to look at. So I really see down the road we could be taking some big steps backward in Alberta compared to what they're doing at the state universities like in North Dakota or Montana.
Right, and so then it's kind of left up to the Cokes and the nutrients to them to do some of the research.
Yeah, and to be honest, groups like Agrium, when they were still around, the old Sheriff Gordon, they had researchers that did research, but not anymore. Or say Wesco, when they had John Ariapik and Rigas Karamanis. But research done, fertilizer research done by private industry is very, very limited. So then we're going to have to look to applied research associations, but they're just not up to speed to doing that kind of thing.
One of my favorite airport run-ins, because when you're traveling throughout the conference season, you're going all over North America, is my airport chats with Rigas.
Yeah, Rigas is a wonderful fellow. I always enjoy talking to him.
Hey, we got one more question here from Ken. Let's get to it here. I'm just going to put it up. Ken asks, any truth to the claims the foliar fertilizer companies are peddling better and more concentrated uptake through the plant? I tried it and got little to no benefit, certainly not world record yields like they were claiming.
Well, I guess the best way to put it is that when you're talking to a salesman talking about his product, he's going to give you the great news. It's like talking to a car salesman.
Naturally.
He's always going to tell you the good news. He's not going to tell you the whole story. But when it comes to foliar fertilizer application, we have to remember that plant roots were designed to take up nutrients. Leaves were designed to capture the energy of the sun and then release and take in various types of gases like carbon dioxide. They'll take carbon dioxide and release oxygen, but they're not designed to take up large amounts of nutrient. Now, if you have, say, for example, a copper deficiency or a zinc deficiency, and you only need to get in 0.2 of a pound per acre into the plant, a foliar application can help. But To be honest, I would look at that as more of an emergency situation to maybe correct a deficiency. If you truly had a copper deficiency, I'd be looking at trying to build your copper levels up in your soil so the roots can take up the copper when the plant needs it, not trying to do it on a foliar application. I kind of made the joke if, as an old beef producer, if you're going to eat a steak, do you want to take it through your mouth or do you want to rub it on your skin and absorb it through your skin? Well, yeah, it just doesn't work. And so and that's sort of a silly analogy, but when it comes to micronutrients, if you do honestly have a deficiency, you're probably better to do it. Apply those in the soil at an adequate rate so the plants can take it up as it needs it, as opposed to doing a foliar application. And some of these foliar products, I know there was one was recommended on if you had a bit of a hail damage, you could spray it on.
Yeah, there's a few of those,
and you give your crop a good boost. But for one of them, I actually calculated you'd have to put on 60 applications to get enough copper into the plant to actually make a difference. So the levels sometimes are so low, it's not even funny.
I remember one time you made a joke where you'd be better off just throwing pennies into the field.
Yeah, I think I did say that. With my Alzheimer's disease, I think I still recall saying
you
that.
did. I remember being at a field day where you said that one time. Hey, Ross, this has been, and Ken, thank you very much for your question. Greatly appreciated. Ken's always watching a lot of these shows. Hey, Ross, I really appreciate you joining me here today. It's so much fun. It's great to have in-studio guests, and hopefully your arm and shoulder get better, and we'll talk again soon.
Well, I've already got my ski pass. I'm an eternal optimist. I'm going to be able to ski this winter. So.
Well, I hope to see you out there for sure.
You bet. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, everybody, for tuning in today. Tomorrow on the show, we're going to have Jeff None. He is a dairy farmer, beef producer from around Edmonton, Alberta. And Jeff is doing some really cool stuff in terms of marketing his farm products directly to the consumer. He's doing it with a cheese plant he built on his farm, as well as his beef products into Edmonton restaurants as well. So it's going to be a fun discussion about how he's building a brand around None cheese and None beef. If you have any feedback on today's show or questions, comments, or theories on anything, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Or you can find us, of course, on social media. We're tweeting at Real Agriculture, or you can find me at Shaun Haney, or you can call the Real Ag listener line. It is 855-776-6147. Tune in to Real Ag Radio on Rural Radio 147. We're going to be live in about 50 minutes on Rural Radio 147. And today we're going to have a conversation with Greg Henderson about a big push in the U.S. for increased transparency of pricing of fat cattle. Things like maybe potentially forcing packers to have a 50% cash market. So interesting stuff that could impact the Canadian market as well. Thank you very much for tuning in today. Thank you for getting real and getting connected with Real Ag Live. And we'll be back again tomorrow, 3 p.m. Eastern, 1 o'clock Mountain. Cheers, everybody.